Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to look at the film adaptation of Amy Tan's book, The Joy Luck Club. She was a scriptwriter on this film, along with a man by the name of Ronald Bass. I think Bass approached her shortly after her book came out. And they got a bunch of other people, and eventually it came out in 1993. So it is decently closely related to the book. There are some changes which I will talk about, and the way the book and the film are obviously very different format. So the book is a little bit harder to follow because it bounces back and forth between the mothers and the daughters. And the way the film works is, with the exception of almost like, what's called the narrator, which is Jun Wu, who's in the book, her story, because her mother is passed, and so she's kind of telling her mother's story as well, so she jumps. But in the film, essentially, you have the mother's story and the daughter's story right next to each other. The book is not like that. So the film is a little bit easier to follow, and that's kind of how I'm going to play this. And as I go over each story, I'm going to tell you the differences between, say, the mother's story and the daughter's story in the film and the book. So, and I'm going to occasionally look at Wikipedia here because I've only seen the film once, and I've only read the book twice. Once recently, once when I was in high school, which was like 2002. Very, very long time ago. So, first major difference is that Bass put in was a framing device. So in the book, the book basically starts with June taking her mother's place at the Joy Luck Club meeting. In the film, they put in a farewell party where she's going off to China to see these long lost sisters that her mother, these twins, basically her sisters, her mother abandoned in China. Her mother abandoned these two babies during World War II along the side of the road. So, and they had been searching for them, and they found them, and so she's on her way to visit them. So they're doing a big farewell party, and this is how it transitions. They use it not only to start the film, but to transition between the mothers and the daughters' stories. So they use this kind of as a anchor point throughout the film, which again is not really true because you don't really need it in the book. So it starts off with, let's bring this up, Lindu and Waverly Young. So it goes back to Lindu's life, and in the film she's 4 years old, and she's promised in marriage to another boy, in her village that she does not know, she has not seen. And so from that point on, her mother treats her as if she isn't hers. It's not that her mother doesn't love her, it's that she's been promised to another family. And so her mother feels her job is to prepare her daughter to be a wife in this other family. And when she's about 14 or 15, her family leaves the village, and she is left with this other family to be this woman's son's wife. So they go they go through the elaborate wedding ceremony. She does not, apparently their face is covered in a red veil for the entire time, so she does not see him until he comes into the bedroom. She's escorted to their bridal bedroom, and he comes in and takes the the veil off, and he's like 12. So yeah, and he orders her to sleep on the floor. He's not sleeping with her. So her mother-in-law, over a couple of years, gets very, very mad at her because he won't have sex with her because, again, he's 12. And she doesn't know anything. Eventually they start sharing a bed like brother and sister. But again, her mother-in-law he lies to his mother. And so her mother-in-law hates her because she has not given her promised grandsons, because again, the son won't actually have sex with her. So at one point in time, the mother-in-law tells her to lay down and stay in the bed and closes the windows because she claims that her son's seed is dripping out of her, and that her son has put tons of seed in her to make dozens of grandsons, and yeah, he's lying through his teeth. So she's left alone in the room. She hears noise outside. She peers outside, and she sees one of the servant girls talking to, I don't know whether it's a delivery boy or someone else. It's another young man, and she's pregnant, and he's gotten her pregnant, and he abandons her, and she's showing at this point, just barely. So I'm guessing about 5 months along. And so Lindo gets an idea. She pretends to be crazy. She claims she wrecks her clothes, wrecks her hair, comes screaming out, starts praying to the ancestor, tells the mother-in-law that the ancestors were haunting her, that it was the matchmaker made a mistake, that she took money to match them, and she was not the proper wife, and that he was going to, basically, if they stayed married, he was going to be eaten alive, and that all her teeth would come out, and that the ancestors have planted his seed in this servant girl who is his true spiritual wife, and so she gets out of her marriage without dishonoring her family. So she gets a ticket to Shanghai. The servant girl is married off to the now 12-year-old, and this woman gets a grandson who's not biologically related to her at all, but hopefully maybe they'll get biological grandchildren. But again, Lindu basically gets a ticket to Shanghai and money, and is eventually obviously goes to the United States. And then it jumps to her daughter, Waverly. Now, Waverly becomes, as a young girl, a chess champion. It doesn't explain how. But she becomes a chess champion as young and gets kind of irritated with her mother because her mother's bragging a lot. And her mother acts like it's her accomplishment and not her daughter's. So Waverly quits chess thinking she can just go back to it. She tries to go back to it and can't. So she obviously quits completely. And then it kind of jumps to later in life. So she married relatively young, a Chinese man, ends up divorcing. She has a daughter. And she's currently engaged to a white man by the name of Rich. And for a while, she's just trying to make her mother notice that she's seeing him, because her mother really didn't like the first husband and convinced her in many ways, just made her feel horrible. And so her mother has a lot of sway over her and how her words affect her quite a bit. And eventually she introduces him and basically lets her mother know they're getting married, and she thinks her mother hates him, and they're at this beauty parlor, and she's having her mother's hair done before the wedding, and kind of her mother tells her story about her life and admits that she likes him. Mother admits, like, I like your fiance. He's a nice guy. I'm not insulting him, and I've known you're in love with him. And it's a kind of a bonding moment between the mother and the daughter. And like, I don't mean to criticize you like crazy. I like him. And that's kind of the end of the story. Now, a couple differences here. With Lindo's story, she knew, in the book, she knew who she was marrying. It's a small village. He was only about a year younger than her. So she knew who he was. And what happened was her family's home was further down in the valley than his family, and they got flooded out and left. And again, she was engaged to be married to this guy. So she goes to live with him, and the mother-in-law sends her to work in the servants' quarters to learn how to cook and to clean and how to be a big, good wife before she officially marries him. And then it kind of plays out similarly to the film, where eventually she starts scheming and she finds this girl and pretty much plays it out that this servant girl is actually the spiritual wife and is able to get out. So that's the major difference here. Trying to think. There's not too much of a difference with the daughter's story, though the mother, they skip out on kind of how they got the chess set, which was through a church thing. It was actually one of her brothers. Waverly has two brothers. It was one of her brothers who got the chess set, and it was like missing a piece, and the daughter found it really easy, and that they kind of cut that out, but that's a kind of a good reason. And again, the mothers, it's kind of understandable. They're just kind of cutting out the fact that she knew him already, and there's a lot more time that lapses in the mother's story than they do. They compress it quite a bit in the book. It doesn't look like it's lasts too long, maybe a couple of years. And I think in the book it's like 10. She's a servant for a while, and then they're married for a while, and it's a while. It takes like 10 years or so for her to eventually get a ticket to Shanghai and vamoose. So that is that story. The next story they say, and then it jumps back to the farewell party. You see Rich and Waverly, and they're happy, and the mother is obviously happy with him, and he gets along with the daughter and everything. So the next one they go to is Ying Ying and Lena St. Clair. This is the one where there's a major difference, but I'm going to go over what the film does. In the film, Ying Ying is wealthy, and she's about 16, and she's married off to a man by the name of Lin Zhao, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he's a philanderer. He's very handsome. They're in a very high society, and he very much romances her. And then she ends up pregnant. She has a baby boy, and he starts having an affair with this opera singer. And one day he forgot to come home, and I think he comes home the next evening, and he's with the opera singer, and he calls Ying Ying a whore, and picks up the son, and is like, this is my child. He hands it to the opera singer, and yeah. And then eventually Ying Ying becomes very, very depressed and drowns her baby boy and kills him. And then, so eventually that she carries it. She essentially loses her soul. And then it jumps to her being in the United States. It doesn't exactly explain how she gets to the USA, how she leaves her husband or anything. But it jumps to Lena, which is her daughter, who is an architect, and Ying Ying has come to visit her and her husband Harold at their apartment. It's a very architecturally strange apartment. It's very bland and very angular and very sharp, and they have a very strange marriage. It's not equal. He is her boss, so he earns a lot more money than she does, but they split everything. And so it's like they split the rent, they split various groceries, they split all sorts of things. They don't sprint some of their personal products, but their argument is basically he'd given her this cat, and he expects her to pay for the flea treatments. And that's kind of the arguments, like, this is, so he's like, it's your cat. And a variety of other things, and it brings up that she's paying for ice cream despite the fact that she doesn't take it. And he makes a joke that he thought she was always dieting, and her mother makes a comment, well, yes, she's dieting until she no longer exists. Essentially, he's a dick. And her daughter, the mother's always been depressed, and the mother is like, she has no soul. So when Lena is having kind of an argument with her husband, her mother knocks over a vase on a table. That's a rickety table. And her daughter comes up, and her mother says, basically decides to give her a soul. She drives herself as a tiger and going to rip a soul free, and tells her daughter that, what do you want? Tell him what you want, and leave this place until you get it. And that's kind of how it seems. It jumps back to the farewell party, and she's with somebody completely different who seems to be giving her what she wants. He's happy. He enjoys her mother-in-law. He enjoys her mother, and they talk about apparently him inviting her to go to Lake Tahoe with them. And obviously she's much, much happier. Now, it's this story where you have a major change that I'm not entirely sure why it's changed, but it might have to do with the United States being really weird. So Ying Ying does not kill her baby. She has an abortion. So the baby's not born yet. I don't think she even knows the sex. She thinks she knows the sex. but she has an abortion. She doesn't drown her child and her little boy in a tub. She has an abortion. He's also not there. He gets her pregnant in Vamooses, and he's always kind of not really been there all that much. And I think he's implied that he's much older than her. And he's off. Yes, he sees an opera singer, but she never sees her. He goes off somewhere else and doesn't come back, essentially. The moment she's pregnant, he doesn't come back. She never sees him again. And after she has an abortion, she leaves and stays with family in the country who are very, very poor for like 10 years before going back to the city and working in a shop where for 4 years she allows Lena's father to court her, and then she gets a letter saying her husband's died, which she suspected because, again, he was one, a bit older, and two, sleeping with anything that moved and probably doing a bunch of drugs and all sorts of things. And then she agrees to go to America with this guy that she does not love. And in fact, in the book, she gives up her name and her birthday. They can't. When she goes to Angel Island, which is it's the San Francisco version of Ellis Island. So that's a real thing. And she gives up her name and goes by Betty. And I think they move her birth date is different. She goes from being a tiger to a dragon, which I think is very different in Chinese, basically in their New Year zodiac. So she's a couple of years, I believe it's either younger or older, I can't remember the book exactly. But she's miserable. The other thing that happens that they cut this out, and for probably good reason, when her family moves out of Chinatown, she's pregnant. And the baby is born, and she knows there's something wrong with it because the house they live in she thinks it's very crooked. It's a very steep hill near San Francisco. And the baby is born with either parts of its brain, parts of its skull, and pretty much dies right there and immediately. It's a little boy, and she feels guilty. And she carries the guilt of having this abortion, but she knew it would trap her. So that is the major difference. So I don't know why they made this change. I think America is weird. It's like, look, we're more interested in forgiving a woman who's depressed and drowns her living child than having an abortion. Which apparently, at least in the book, it was very common in China. At least this is mentioned in Amy Tan's book. So it's a very interesting change. I can see why they cut out the other baby boy because it doesn't really bring much to the story. But it's a strange change. The other thing is basically it ends with Lena getting divorced. It doesn't see her happily with somebody else. It ends with her basically getting divorced. So let's move on to the next one. So this is Anime and Rose Hansu. So again, this one sticks a bit mostly closer to this. With Anime, it starts with her she ends up being scarred because her mother comes home and there's a huge fight and they're banging the table and basically soup splashes on her. And then it jumps. She hasn't seen her mother since she was tiny because her mother was banished. She's living with her mother's family and her grandmother is now dying. She's about maybe 8 or 9 years old. And her mother comes. Her mother has been living as the third concubine of this wealthy man. And she comes because her mother is dying and makes her mother a soup out of her own blood. Basically, it's the ultimate kind of sacrifice to try to save her mother's life, which it doesn't. Her mother dies. And then Anime chooses to go back with her mother. And they go back to this house where her mother is this fourth wife. And the second wife gives her this pearl necklace to win her over. Shortly after, her mother shows her that it's glass, so it's fake. And then one night, she's sent to go stay with her nanny because the husband comes to essentially use her mother. and the nanny tells her the truth, what actually happened. Her mother was praying at the temple to honor Anna-May's father, and she meets the second wife. Second wife coaxes her to meet her husband, invites her over to basically play. I cannot remember the name of this game. Probably it's, where is it? It's mentioned here. Is it mentioned? Basically, it's the, why can I not remember? It's very important because it's the game that the Joy Luck Club plays. So, let's see. But yeah, her mother brings her over to basically play this game and tells her to spend the night, and he rapes her. The husband comes in and rapes her and gets her pregnant. And her family doesn't believe her that she's been raped. They disgrace her. She has no choice. She's pregnant. And so she has to go back and become this fourth wife. So that's essentially what happens. And once she gives birth to the baby boy, the second wife claims him as her own. And so then the mother, once the daughter knows this, she tells her mother, and her mother chooses to commit suicide 3 days before the Chinese New Year. This is important. Mother poisons herself eating sweet sticky buns filled with opium, and eventually dies of a drug overdose. And then, because it's 3 days before the Chinese New Year's, all debt must be paid. So she enables Anna-May to take revenge, because the husband is afraid of her mother's ghost coming back and taking revenge, because again, he raped her and she's been treated like garbage. Basically, Anna-May at her mother's funeral tells him this, that basically you owe us because my mother's will come back and haunt you. And she goes and she grabs her little brother's head and brings him over with her and pretty much yells at him. And he's terrified because, again, this is old China and this is their belief system, and he's afraid of her mother's ghost. So he promises to revere her mother as if she was his first wife, his only wife, and raise Anna-May and her brother as if they were his only children. So as if they were the daughter, basically as the children of the first wife, and have very much the highest status. And then the second wife comes to pay her respects, and Anna-May screams and crushes the glass beads on the table and says on that day, second wife's hair began to turn white. So she basically found her voice. Now it switches to her daughter, Rose. Now, Rose is married to a white man by the name of Ted Jordan, and he fell in love with her because of her strong spirit. But because she found out that his family was racist, she started becoming similar to her grandmother and being a pushover. And they're in the process of getting a divorce. They have a daughter, but they're getting divorced, and he's pretty much calling all the shots. And her mother comes and tells her this story and basically tells her, it's like, you and I was raised the old Chinese way, to basically swallow my own sorrow, swallow everybody else's, so to speak, and just kind of be meek and not have a voice. And even though I tried to raise you different, you came out the same way. And she's like, it's perhaps because I was born to my mother and I was born a girl, and you were born to me and you were born a girl. But you cannot do this. You need to find your voice. And then it switches to Rose standing out in the rain at the house, and her husband, her soon-to-be ex-husband, coming out. It's like, you haven't answered your phone. You haven't signed the papers. And she's like, I'm not leaving. You're not taking my house. You're not taking my daughter. And I was wrong to think your love was more worthy than mine. She basically, and then she implies that she's a reincarnation of her grandmother, and that it's not too late, she's going to take her power back. And then it switches back to the farewell party. and it seems that she is back with her husband. So that's kind of how her story ends. Now, a couple of things are different in the book. First thing is, Anime's first story is about how she gets lost as a little girl when she's like 2 or 3 at the New Year's celebration. She falls into the water and she loses her family, and then she interacts with the moon priestess, or I can't remember what it was. Turns out this person's a man. And then she's found, and she doesn't really remember how she's found by her family. But that's kind of the first story. But then it goes to the current one, which pretty much plays out very similar. But the background story is a little different. Her mother isn't pregnant right away. It takes 4 years for her to get pregnant with her little boy. And so she is outcasted by her family. That's not because she's pregnant. She just doesn't. It's pre-World War II China. She's a woman. She has no status. If her family kicks her out, she has to go back. The other thing they cut out is the fact that when her and Anime go there, the house at first, nobody's home at the time. And they're coming, basically they come back. And he come back with a 5th wife, just some young girl from the villagers. And then eventually it's explained to Anime about the power the second wife holds. The first wife, technically his legal wife, has 2 older daughters, but she's only able to give him daughters. And eventually the second wife gets her hooked on opium and keeps her depressed and kind of takes control. And then she finds the third wife, who again gives him more daughters. And she essentially kind of holds everything over her, that you're worthless. And this is essentially what she does with Anime's mother. And one of the things that she does is, the second wife feigns suicide a lot. So, yeah. First, she supposedly takes the opium, and then basically it's implied that she just knows how to act and stops and just basically plays committing suicide to gain power and money and control over everything. And she does the same thing with the 5th wife, where she frequently sends her home to her old village to remind her that you have no power, essentially. And so it's explained why the second wife has all this power. And then it is also said that it's thought that Anime's mother takes the opium, but Anime implies it's a different type of poison. In the film, it shows her crying over her mother, trying to get her to wake up. In the book, she's very much aware her mother is dying, and her mother is kind of having seizures. And she says she's walking, essentially, and she's moving around, so she's not still. She's having seizures, and they're just waiting for her to die. And there's no screaming in the book. Anime doesn't yell out her mother, call out mama. She doesn't. There's no voiceover where she's explaining what's the Chinese belief. It's just known. Basically, she says it's like her mother's, I don't know exactly, rapist. That's probably the best way to describe. Knows all this, and he promises to her that she will be raised, her and her brother, as if her mother was the first wife. So that's a difference in the story. The other difference is Rose and her husband don't get back together. He's essentially he shows up. I don't know whether she's outside in the rain or not. I think she's outside in the garden. It's messy. And she tells him she's gotten her. He basically complains like he's planning to get married to somebody else. And she hasn't signed the papers. And she kind of hands him the papers, realizes she hasn't done anything. And she says, I've gotten my own lawyer. You're not getting my house. You're not getting my kid. And it's implied very much that she gets a much better settlement. She gets to keep her child. She gets to keep the house. And he goes off somewhere else. So as opposed to the film where it looks like they've reconciled. So that's the other major difference. So the final stories are about Sunyan and Jun Wu. Now, one of the other major differences, they do use Jun's Chinese name, which I think is Jun Mei. but in the film they just used June. So this one is kind of how it ends. You get, after you hear all those stories, you go back to the party and eventually things are winding down. You will also find out early on how they explain how she knows about her the babies, because her mother would tell her about the babies, but she doesn't know what happened. Her mother basically said she arrived in this village with nothing, and she never explained what happened with the babies. And during a church picnic, it said that the Joy Luck Club, her mother's friends, come and tell her that after her mother's death, they went looking for the babies and they eventually find them. And they got a letter back and they told her, basically they show it to June, but it's in Chinese. I'm not sure which Chinese. That's the other thing the film and the book differ on, probably because it makes it simpler. In the film, there's two different Chinese languages that are mentioned. There's Cantonese and there's Mandarin. So some of the mothers, particularly I think, whether it was St. Clair, no, it's not St. Clair. I think it's Lindu, I believe. Yeah, because she meets, Anime is the one who sets her up. So it's Lindu who, her and her husband don't speak the same language. So I believe one of them speaks Mandarin, one of them speaks Cantonese. So it is a completely different language. But again, in the film, they simplify it for just saying it's Chinese. But in the beginning of the film, you have this scene where June's basically given this letter. She can't understand it because, again, it's in a Chinese language, either Mandarin or Cantonese. I can't remember which. And basically, she has no idea what it says. And Lindu, I think it's not Lindu. It's Anime who lies to her. She claims that, basically, claims that she told the twins that their mother had died. So you jump back to the end of this party and she has to come clean. Because the other two women are like, it's not right. You have to tell her that you did not tell them that they think their mother's alive, that you wrote a letter back to them implying that she was alive. And so Anime does in fact tell her, and it's like, could not write this letter. It's better that you tell them in person that their mother they've been looking for a long time is dead, because you are their sister. And then it jumps to her basically packing, and her father says, he hands her, these are pictures of your mother. It's like, I don't need pictures to remember Mama. I have memories. You have memories. They don't. So he wants her to give them photographs. And then he shows her, now at the beginning of the film, and I forgot to mention, it's an overture of June telling the story that her mother would tell her, that her mother bought a swan at a Chinese market, and I think it's Hong Kong, and she takes it over with her on the boat to San Francisco and tells her, it's like, these are basically, the swan represents her dreams and their life, the way they're going to have this wonderful life in America. And when they get to Angel Island, they take the swan from her, and all she has is this feather. And she basically says that this feather may look worthless, but it holds all my dreams and hopes for you, and it comes from afar. So in this scene with June and her father, he hands her an envelope, and basically this is a feather. And it also implies you also kind of go back to, June has this basically memory of her last Chinese New Year with her mother and her mother's crab. And basically they invited, I think it's not Waverly, it's not Rose either. It is Waverly. It's Waverly and her family are over. And Waverly's a hot shot at her work, and June is a freelance writer. And Waverly basically implies that June's work is not good enough for them. And then it jumps to a conversation between Sunyan, which is June's mother, and her in the kitchen. And June thinks that her mother, because her mother said something about Waverly, about you have to be born with style. And June thinks, her mother implies that Waverly was better than her. And her mother's like, no. I never wanted you. I had hopes for you, because it's also implied that you have a little bit of the background of June, of her mother wanting her to be a big concert pianist. And she never was. She paid for the man downstairs. She traded cleaning services to have her teach June how to play the piano. But he was pretty much deaf at this point, so she could goof off. And she never really practiced. And then she had a recital, which she screwed up at, and she never wanted to play the piano again. And she was never a prodigy like, say, Waverly, who was with the chess. And they had this conversation years later, and her mother said, I wanted you to be happy, and I love you for who you are. And that Waverly essentially implies that Waverly is stuck up. It's like, you have a good heart. Waverly will take the best crab. You'll take the worst one because basically you're a good person. So now, instantly, there is a bit of a difference in the book. In the book, the mother takes the crab and it was already dead, and it shows a whole scene of them going to Chinatown to get these crabs. And she's like, her mother isn't the one who is the one who doesn't eat it. And again, it's a similar conversation. It gets to the heart of that conversation between mother and daughter. And mother's like, I only wanted what was best for you, and I love you for who you are. And she gives her daughter this jade necklace. And it's like, I've worn this since the day you were born, and now I'm giving it to you. So, and then it kind of jumps back to June with her father, and her father talking to her and giving her the real backstory of what happened with her mother, and how her mother, they were in this town, and she had a wheelbarrow with the babies, and she was carrying them, trying to get to this town and you see crowds of people trying to escape because the Japanese were coming. And she was sick. She had the dysentery. She thought she was dying. So her wheelbarrow broke. She couldn't carry the baby. She had blisters on her hands and blisters on her feet. She thought she was going to die. And so she put the babies on the side of the road. She puts pictures of her and jewels and necklaces and stuff, wraps them in their clothing, and leaves them hoping that somebody will find them and look after them, and then assumes to get away so she can go die, essentially, because she doesn't want people to abandon her babies because they see a dead mother hanging around, and fear that they don't want dead mother's ghost following them around. And that's essentially what happens. Now, it's a little bit different in the book. In the book, her first husband takes her and the babies to this other city. I can't remember the name of it. And I probably would mispronounce it anyway. And she and the babies are living there, and there's refugees. He's an army officer. A big thing. So he goes off to another city. And she's in this city, and she starts up the Joy Luck Club with a few other women, and they feast every week and play Mahjong. I think that's the name of the game. That's the game of the women play in the previous anime story. That's what her mother was invited over to play, was Mahjong. I think I'm going to play. It's a matching game with tiles. So, but her mother, Sunyan, had invited these women over, and every week they feast and they talk about their hopes and their dreams and wonderful things in the past. But then one night, a officer comes and tells her, the Japanese are coming, you need to get the heck out, because they kill, basically, you know what happens, is the Japanese will execute officers' wives and their families immediately. So she gets a wheelbarrow, leaves in the middle of the night with her stuff and her twin daughters. And so she's pushing, and she's hoping to catch a ride. But there are so many people fleeing the city, the cars are just driving by. So she pushes and she pushes until the wheelbarrow breaks. And you see people dropping their valuables, and she slowly does the same. Heaviest things first, slowly dropping as much as they can, because they're walking and walking and walking. She ties, the wheelbarrow breaks, she takes scarves, she's carrying her babies on her back for as long as she can. She's sick, she's starving, she's exhausted. And finally, now they're older. In the book, they're older. They're at least maybe a year, so they're sitting up, they're interactive. I think they can say mama. So she sits them down on the side of the road, they're wrapped up. She puts jewels and pictures and things of them, of her and her family, and tells them that she's going to come and get them. And then she leaves, hoping someone's going to take care of them because she thinks she's dying. And she's actually picked up by missionaries and survives. And she searches for them. They go back to Shanghai, but everything is destroyed. And she looks and calls for people, but she never finds them. Eventually, her first husband she gets to the city, and he's long dead. She remarries, and eventually they go to America. And she keeps searching. She calls people, calls an old classmate and stuff, trying to find them. And it's after their death that they get a letter back from the friend who had found these twins, because they thought she was crazy. It's like, you're never going to find them. You lost 2 little babies during the war? It's impossible, but they'd found them. And they find out the backstory. What had happened to them is there was this couple who were living in the caves not far from this road. And they would come out and grab things alongside the road, various things they thought they could use. And one day they found these babies. And they'd never seen jewels and silks like this before, so they take them in. And for 8 years, they look after them. And by this time, the woman has fallen in love with these kids. These little girls have become hers. But she wants them to find their real family. And so she takes them to Shanghai, but street names have changed, things have been destroyed. And so it's pretty much implied that they're basically raised by these families, always wondering, because they have pictures of their mother. They know who she was. They have pictures of this family. And they know that they were adopted and that their mother basically had to abandon them. And I don't think they blame her. It's not implied what they think, because you don't really get much from them. So you get the backstory. You don't get that backstory in the film. So you just get the fact that she abandoned them and survived. And it's implied that basically the Joy Luck Club, Jun's aunties went searching for them, when it was in fact her mother who had gone searching. And they just get this letter after she's passed. And then the other major difference is Jun's father goes with her on this trip. And in the film they show boats. In the book it's airplanes. I mean, they fly over, and then they take to another, firstly to see some of her father's family, and then they fly again to Shanghai. So there's no boats. I mean, again, it's 90s China. So airplanes. But again, so her father is with her. And then she comes upon, and it basically ends with her coming upon her sisters and explaining that their mother had died and that she was their sister. And it does, I feel like the film and the book end on the same note of her basically hugging her sisters. But again, her father is with her. So, and it's different. These women look like her mother. And it's implied that she sees her own face looking back at her. They look very much the same. So they all they take after their mother. So that's how both the book and the film end. And she's able to Jun's able to make peace with her mother. And that's pretty much how all the girls are. The mothers and daughters reconnect, and through their stories. So the mother's sufferings and the daughter's kind of understandings, and they join back together. So my opinions of the film. I enjoy the film. It's not a family film. It's not a family film at all. This is not similar to the book. You don't want to show this to anyone who's maybe not a teenager. Because again, you have rape. In the book, your woman has an abortion. In the film, she kills her own child. You also pretty much, you have the arranged marriage of spousal abuse. In fact, the film, I think, the film has very much taught. One of the criticisms is its negative portrayal of Chinese men. Because, let's see, Harold's a dick. Anna May's mother's raped. Lindu's husband's kind of useless and a teenager. It's a more bad impression on his mother, but he's useless. And then St. Clair's husband, again, is an abusive dick. Both in the book and the film. He's more of an abusive dick in the film. Because again, in the book, he vamooses. And she doesn't want to marry him. That's the other thing. She's not romanced by this guy in the book. It's an arranged marriage. It's China. Before World War II or during World War II. I mean, but again, this is not a film you show to anyone who's not in high school. The same with that book. Don't go near that book unless you're in high school. And late high school would be my opinion. Just because of these strong, very, very strong topics. Again, abortion happens, arranged marriage, rape. St. Clair's story is a whole heck of a lot darker. So, and very much so is, I mean, all the mother stories are a heck of a lot darker than they are in the film. The film is a little bit more upbeat, but again, you still see a woman being raped, not graphically, but again, she's raped, cutting herself to give her mother her blood. You see a woman being abused, and again, killing the baby thing. Let's see. You see divorce, which not necessarily a bad thing for films, but you see, I mean, Lena's relationship with her husband is abusive. He's a dick, which is sad because I happen to like that actor. But again, it's not a family film. It's very much a feel-good movie. It's definitely a film to watch with your teenage daughter. Between mothers and daughters, it's a mother-daughter film. It's very much geared, as is the book. But for the film, maturity level, late high school. The same with the book. It's just, it's hard to get anything out of it until you're a little bit more mature. I mean, early high school maybe, but these topics are really, really strong. And I personally would not show it to my daughter until she's at least 16. Just because of how dark it is. I just don't think it's going to appeal. I know they watch things like, I don't know, the Hunger Games, which are dark and gritty. But this isn't fantasy. This is very much based, well, it's not based on Amy Tan's life. It's loosely based on stories that she's told. So the events that she's describing could have happened to different people in different lives. So it's more realistic and historic of the environment that was going on in pre-World War II and during World War II China, and even a little bit of post-World War II China. And then it's talking, I think, because the book comes out in 89, so the daughters it's more 80s, as opposed to the film, which is again early 90s. So it's a little bit of a different aesthetic, but I can't get over the fact that I have a toddler at this age, and you see a woman in the film accidentally drown her own child. So yeah, that's a rough thing to watch. So I really wouldn't recommend this book or the film until earliest high school. I mean, I read it when I was a junior, and because of my dyslexia, I didn't get too much out of the book because the formatting. I mentioned this in my book review. Please definitely check that out. I do enjoy the film. The film makes it a lot easier to follow the stories, but again, it deals with some pretty heavy subject matters, similar to my review of The Color Purple. So why both the book and film, this isn't for the faint of heart. It's very, very strong topics, particularly for homeschoolers. These are films you're definitely going to have to discuss and talk about the history and talk about these heavy subjects. So why kids can watch some of the nitty gritty and read some of these things like the Hunger Games or other dystopian novels. No, I'm not covering any. I can't stand them. Right here, not going there. I do not like them. I'm not going to cover them. The closest thing I've seen to the Hunger Games films is Dominic Noble's reviews of them. And that's enough for me. I don't want to go anywhere near them. They're depressing. I've read The Giver and the couple books that went after it. Again, really weird, really depressing, not my thing. But moving back to this, really heavy subject matter. So, my personal opinion, 16 at the youngest. really. And very much, both book and film is something that mothers and daughters want to watch together and have discussions about it, because the main core of the story is fantastic. I'm not talking down about either one of these. The book and the film are great. They just have heavy subject matters. And it's very much about mother-daughter bonding and trauma. It's mother's trauma translating into daughter's trauma, and how sometimes a mother's past can affect their daughters in the present. And that's really what it is. The entire point of both this film and the book is the effect of trauma on the second generation, and how a mother's life can negatively affect her daughters, and how they can reconcile that relationship and bring basically the mother-daughters coming back together and forgiving one another and trying to understand one another. So, which is why honestly I think, particularly high school, this is a good thing to do, particularly if mother-daughters are bumping heads with each other. This is a good book and good film to watch, because mothers explain their trauma. They explain, this was what I lived through. And I didn't intend to unload my trauma onto you. I wanted you to have a better life. And particularly with this film. These women leave everything behind and come to America for a better life. And the book, again, the film cuts out a lot. It cuts out how Anime and Lindu meet, how Anime introduces Lindu to her husband, and how they speak, again, different Chinese languages. You have Mandarin and you have Cantonese. Different languages. They didn't understand each other. And St. Clair's life, because again, she goes by, in the book, it's Betty St. Clair, and how she doesn't particularly like her husband, and he's dead. So he's a white guy. He's not brought up in the film at all. He's dead, and she never loved him. But she allowed him to romance her, even though he had nothing compared to what she'd had. So that's the book, though. Again, probably gonna wrap this up. It's a great film. It's a great book. Heavy subject matter, very much a topic for mother-daughters to discuss together, particularly about the past traumas the mother has suffered and how it may be currently affecting their mother-daughter relationship, and how mothers, in many ways, in order to heal the past, have to talk about their past to their daughters in order to heal that relationship, so the mother can understand the mother better. And on a personal level, God, do I wish my own mother would do that. My mother had a crappy childhood, a crappy adolescence, if you'd call it that, and she's never talked about it, at least not with me. So, calling on mothers, if you have past trauma, talk to your daughters about it, particularly as I said, when they're older. Talk to your daughters. Don't be ashamed of it. Talk to your daughters. Because if you have a strained relationship, that might be why. And that's kind of the entire point of this book. And the film is the healing, because the mothers are finally basically telling their daughters about their traumas and healing the past and healing their relationships with their daughters. So that's it for this review. If you like what you see, hopefully you checked out my book review of this. Be sure to like and subscribe. Check out the rest of my videos. I cover my other big heavy videos this month are the color purple. Again, a really heavy subject matter. I do some fun stuff as well. Be sure to check out what I've got. I do a lot of book reviews and film reviews. Mostly a lot of it, I have a lot of younger kids stuff. A lot of picture books. Some fun films, a variety of different stuff on the literature sections. I have a whole bunch more planned. I do a sprinkling of travel videos, and occasionally I'll do I have a set of homeschooling law videos, which I've done because we are a homeschooling family. We are not religious, so that's, again, the topic. We are a non-religious homeschooling family. So all my stuff it steers away from religion as much as humanly possible in most cases. So that is it for this review. Again, like and subscribe if you like what you see. Check out what I've got, and looking forward to more. Thank you.